Okay, so we started the recording of the session with Dr. Arnaldo Darroy. And let me switch to speaker mode and make you a co-host so that you can share your screen.
Okay, let me see where just give me a second. Okay, can you see the screen now?
We can.
Awesome. Okay. Hey guys, thank you for the introduction, Asia. It's a pleasure to be here and talking with you all. As the introduction says, I am an assistant professor of literature, and my areas of focus include examining examining conflict. And conflict can be war, it can be genocide, it can be other forms of conflicts as well, but examining them primarily through literature and fiction. So, and I believe this class examines and looks at genocide and war through the lens of gender and history. Am I right, Asya?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so I'm going to pitch this talk in those areas, right? So broadly, I'll be talking a little bit about teaching about war and genocide through literature. Is that even an appropriate lens to look at war and genocide literature? Is it? And then we will also be talking about how even like when we are thinking about literature, and we're like talking about war and genocide through literature, we can a lens, a gendered lens to these questions is very central. And so I kind of will touch on all these aspects during my talk. So, I mean, I think the ground zero from where we can start is should war and genocide be represented through literature? And I have used fiction because literature is too broad a term. And like when I say literature, I am in this context, at least, talking about fiction. That is something that's different from the opposite of fiction, that is real, or what often we understand as historical, right? So can we talk about war and genocide in terms of fiction, right? So like this is a different way of phrasing a question about literature. It's a different way of phrasing this question, right? But this question has existed for a very long time, right? And it kind of, another version of this question is that, is literature useful in a social context? Can we think about literature as something that promotes a positive social consciousness, right? And this question has been raging debate since like antiquity, and I'm talking about Aristotle and Plato. I mean, I hope you've like heard of these two names. These were classical philosophers from Greece, and they kind of had this debate, right? Plato, in his works, Republic mainly, kind of said that literature has no place in society because it kind of distracts a person from things that are important, like duty, truth, stuff like that. Aristotle, who was also his disciple, kind of challenged that and said, no, you're wrong. You've got it wrong. I mean, you're right about many things, but you're not right about literature. And Aristotle said, like, and these are like paraphrases, my own words. So reading literatures can often stimulate emotions in human beings, which in turn can influence our ability to morally evaluate our situation, event, or an object, right? So whatever situation is in front of you, if you're reading literary works about it, it can influence you to a particular way of thinking about it. Yeah. And as we will see, like, this is a very central force because of which literature is still relevant in our lives today. Okay, so again, returning back to that original question, can we use literature as a frame of reference to talk about war and genocide? I mean, clearly there are many who would side with Plato in this dynamics and would say that no, literature isn't a useful criteria for evaluating war or genocide. And one of the most prominent voice to take this side against literary co-option was Theodore Adorno, like a classic philosopher from the 20th century, who said that when genocide becomes cultural property in committed literature, it becomes easier complying with the culture that gave rise to the murder. So Adorno's perspective is pretty much, Adorno is saying that literature trivializes war in a way that it becomes common property, and then it can easily be co-opted by the side that originally intended the war, right? So it becomes normalized. Literature normalizes a tragedy. So I think like that was Adorno's basic problem. Like history, on the other hand, for Adorno Adorno would say history retains the authenticity of a tragedy because it supposedly reports facts and it does not trivialize a tragedy by making stories about it, right? Which may or may not be real, and reality may be a little stretched, right? I mean, he has a point, but there is the other side too. There are many scholars who feel that that literature is valuable in when it is used in certain contexts for looking at war and genocide, right? So this guy, Lawrence Langer, kind of says the fundamental task of the critic is not to ask whether it should or can be done, since it already has been, but to evaluate how it has been done, judge its effectiveness, and analyze its implication for literature and for society. So basically, this what is being said here is, I mean, whether one likes it or not, literature is a powerful medium for communicating about war and genocide. So I think the more important question is to really analyze that what kind of literary expression is most effective and sincere for the representation of war and literature, and war and genocide. Yeah, and then we get another perspective that says our duty is to genocide victims, after our duty to genocide victims is to break the international silence and to narrate their trauma. And however that is done is a service in certain ways, right? So yeah, I guess that sets the stage for the conversation that I'm trying to establish here, right? Is literature an effective medium then, right? So let's say it is, right? And why is it an effective medium? Because literature has mass appeal. Now, here, literature may be like a theoretical term, but when I say literature, I mean a lot of things, right? I mean like novels, I mean poetry, I mean graphic novels, comic books, movies, TV shows, right? Like all of that would be a part of the whole categorization of literature. So yeah, so literature has mass appeal in that sense, right? I mean, one is more likely to get informed about events through these avenues rather than a historical text, right? That reports facts, supposedly, right? So since it has mass appeal, so since literature has a larger mass appeal, it has more control over public opinion, right? So I mean, so communicating through literature can really influence the way a public feels about something. It could be war, it could be some kind of a conflict, it could be a natural disaster, and we see this all the time today, right? Like the media, the way it, the kind of information that we get from media, movies, books, uh, newspaper outlets, news outlets, right? It like consciously and unconsciously kind of affects the way we think about these things. So yeah, literature, broadly conceived, has mass appeal. So it depends then that how is it communicating a particular event, right? So historically, literatures in certain contexts have been a positive force in terms of representing trauma, and particularly related to war and genocide, right? Mainly because literatures, as Aristotle says, has the ability to move a person, right? When you're reading a novel and you're really engaged in a character, you start empathizing with the character and you start experiencing both the victories as well as the losses that the character goes through over the course of the novel or over the course of the movie that you're watching or the TV show that you're watching, right? So you start feeling for the character, right? So in a way, that medium is generating certain kinds of empathy in you for the characters, right? So in that sense, literatures are a good medium for promoting empathy for victims and survivors of wars, right? I mean, it can be, right? And that is why many scholars have seen literature as a perennial training school for empathy, right? So the idea here is that literatures can have the ability to train human beings to think empathetically about victims and survivors, right? So yeah, there is a category of literatures that, if we given an opportunity, can make us more empathetic towards survivors. However, literature is like, it can swing any way, right? So if there are literatures that can generate empathy for survivors, then there are literatures that are also designed to block empathy for survivors, right? And that often happens through propaganda, right? Like those literatures that are targeted towards a particular political end, that those literatures want you to think about a war in a particular way, that this side is good and that side is bad, and whatever's happening to that other side, they had it coming and they deserve it, right? So like literatures can push you to think along those ways, that your side, whatever where you stand in the dynamics is right, and murder and conquest is justified. And the other side, even though people are dying on the other side, they deserve it because there's a larger cause, right? And propaganda has often been recruited by many regimes around the world that have established dictatorial situations, right? Like the propaganda is one of the biggest weapons of like war and genocide, right? Making people, through stories and through literatures, making people buy into the agenda, right? So yeah, so again, so literatures, in certain contexts, some literatures can be dedicated to generate empathy for victims, whereas there are some literatures that promote racisms, literatures that promote all kinds of phobias, right, as justified, have the potentials of reducing the survivor in to a dehumanized level, right? Literatures have the power to do both. So that's why many scholars have said, yeah, literatures can be productive, a productive medium for looking at war and literature, but it depends on how you read literatures, right? You have to be conscious about these different contradicting functions that literatures have, right? So here, like at the bottom, I do have an example, right? Like from this poet, Wilfred Owen, who talks about propaganda, right? My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulcet et decorum est. It's sweet and meet to die for one's country, right? So, I mean, it kind of, like many armies and many military around the world often kind of valorize the work that uh, armies do, right? Like it's romanticized in that sense, right? And it kind of, and especially in like situations of intense war, recruitment is done through like exaggerations that dying for your country is a great cause. But then Wilfred Owen, who himself was a foe soldier, after experiencing war, kind of acknowledges that all that is a lie, because once you see dead bodies all around you, you realize that there is nothing glorious about war. There is nothing glorious about death, no matter which side it's happening. Yeah. Okay, so again, so my point was, it is then important to kind of separate the different functions that literatures can serve in representing genocide and war, right? Because again, a literature can be a friend of the victim, and it can be the victim's greatest enemy. Depends on what kind of literatures you're looking at. Okay, so now, I mean, Asya mentioned that my specialization is South Asia. So my references are also going to be South Asian. So at this point, I am going to talk a little about gender and how it plays such an important role in discourses of both war and literature, right? Okay. So, war, no matter what cultural context you look into, has always been represented in very masculine terms, right? I mean, army generals, like masculine, male, it's very chauvinistic, right? So I mean, and so gender awareness when it comes to thinking about war is very polarized. So yeah, I mean, like a majority, like when you're looking at literatures about war, especially popular literatures, like ones that you would find in movies, films, Hollywood, right? There is a machismo is used as a lens of looking at war. Women, at least, have a very limited role in how they function within these narratives about war and genocide, right? I mean, first of all, right, there aren't as many women writers of war highlighted as there are men, right? It's again a very polarized representation, right? And even in these narratives, women function as very limited tropes, right? So there is often, at least I'm talking about South Asian literature, but like the things that I'm saying is definitely not limited to the South Asian context. You can like find it in the way Hollywood represents war as well, right? Like women have very specific roles, right? Like they play, on the one hand, there is something called the politics of purity, right? Women within war narratives are often seen as mothers, right? Mothers who are sacred, who are pure. They are almost like the nation themselves. So they are pretty much personifications of the nation, right? So the idea here, the ideology behind seeing women as mother is that during a war, you have to do everything to protect your mother, right? Because protect the purity of your mother. I mean, of course, this mother can often become a wife too, but again, the woman, the role of the mother is often seen as subordinate to the main male protagonist, right? And this woman, the purity of the woman is like the purity of the nation, right? Which must be defended And that is what makes war glorious, right? So that is a defensive point of view. But however, war also means conquest, right? So war literally represents one side dominating the other side and defeating it in a very masculine, violent way, right? So this violent way is often within literatures and within the human mind represented sexually, right? So conquest, colonizing a region is almost like sexually dominating a body, right? Which is a part of the whole machismo, right? It's not the machismo, is sexual dominance, right? So women are also represented as victims of war. So a victory often signals through sexual violence. So a mother is again a trope in war literatures, but women often function as these sexual victims in war literatures, right? And there's another type, the seductress, right? Often women of the other side are seen as seductresses who have to be sexually dominated and conquered, right? And then that would follow the victimization. So a conquest over the body of a woman would ultimately signal a conquest over a land, right? So if you look at war literatures, you would find these tropes abundantly, right? In one way or the other, right? So these are some images of popular representations of these roles that women play within the context of a war. The middle image, the one where there are two guys, is different. It's not a film. It's from a music video that was published in India. Now, India, there's this region called Kashmir. And Kashmir is one of the hottest military zones in the world today, where there's a lot of conflict going on between two groups, Hindus and Muslims, right? So, and India right now has a Hindu majority government. So there has been propagandistic materials that is calling Hindu males from all over India to go to Kashmir and marry and dominate and own Muslim women. It's propaganda. And this image kind of represents that. And then to the left, where you see Mother India, is another classic image of the nation as the mother. The woman that you see in front of you in the middle, upper middle, is the classic image of the wife who is pure, and the husband is a soldier, has to do everything, even like sacrifice their lives to protect the purity of the wife. Again, a metaphor of how one must protect the nation. And finally, to the right, it's a more ancient image of war where the woman is a seductress. So yeah, these images have often been very common in literature. In like women have played very stereotypical roles when it comes to war. And again, I am here talking about South Asia, but it's definitely, these kind of representations are definitely not limited to South Asia. So what is the point then, right? I mean, I talked about propaganda and literatures that are truly empathetic, right? So even though when there is war and conflict, it is easier to find propaganda than works that are actually empathetic to victims, right? But real, genuine works that really try to understand the pain of victims, not only from one side, but from both sides, those works do exist. So the last part of this talk, I want to focus on some women writers from India who have, against threats, against many different kinds of hardships, who have worked in representing the true pain of war and genocide in different contexts from India. So, I mean, if you come to think about it, and if you look at, and if you research it, some of the most enduring, genuine, empathetic accounts of war and genocide and mass murder, at least from South Asia, and I'm sure that would also hold for other parts of the world as well. Some of the most genuine accounts come from women writers. So I have chosen 3 writers randomly who talk about 3 different kinds of conflicts and wars. So the first is this figure. Her name, she passed away in 2016. Her name was Mahashweta Devi. She was a Bengali writer and activist. I think I have a map that kind of shows, like, if you see like the area West Bengal, it's right next to Bangladesh. She actually comes from there. So she was a leftist. She was in the left spectrum of the whole political debate. And she dedicated her life to working for the rights and empowerment of tribal communities from India. Tribal communities were in India are the poorest of the poor, right? Like, to an extent that the government ultimately recognized her through the title, the mother of the suburbs, right? She became like that figure, like whose name synonymously came up with advocacy for tribal communities in India, right? And again, she wrote about conflict related to tribals, but she was also engaged in activisms against government encroachment of tribal land. Now, one of the events that really figures centrally in her writing is the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971, which is also known more in other contexts. It is also called the Bangladesh Genocide. It was a liberation war where Bangladesh separated itself from joint identity with Pakistan, which was on the other side of the continent, and Bangladesh became an independent nation. But as with the birth of many nations around the world, it came with immense violence and death and sexual dominance, right? So the death toll is estimated between 300 to 3 lakhs, 3 crore people. So many so many people estimated, so many women estimated to be raped by a systematic campaign of genocidal rape, right? So this event was centrally figured in Mahashata Devi's writing, mainly because it also coincided with tribal oppression in this Bengal area. Like you see West Bengal, the part in the red, and Bangladesh. This is where the war happened, but this is also where the tribals existed, and because of this war, they also got displaced, right? So one story that really brings out these struggles is Dopadi. It's one of our most prominent stories. And it kind of explores the interconnections between the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971 and the Naxalite movement in West Bengal, which was a movement that represented the struggles between tribal communities of Bengal, again, Bengal, and the Indian government over land, because what the government wanted was to clear the land that was populated by the tribals for the development of industries, and the government tried to illegally encroach these lands, right? So these two events kind of coincided because the Naxalite movement happened in the 70s and the 60s, right? So this whole red portion that you see in the map, this is called the Red Corridor. And this is the entire region where the Naxalite struggle happened. It started in West Bengal, but it kind of went down all the way to the southern part of India, to Karnataka. And in her stories, whether it focuses on the Bangladesh Liberation War side or the Naxalite side, she explores, the main idea that she explores is how this war, rape became a central weapon against victims, right? And again, and she kind of asked that, like, do victims who she often, because she worked in collaboration with another scholar, Gayatri Spivak, and she asks that, do these victims have a voice after their lives have been destroyed? Can they tell their stories? So these are some of the questions that resonate from the works of Mahashata Devi. Okay. The second person that I want to talk about, her name was Fullan Devi. She passed away. She was actually assassinated in 2001. She was an activist. She was a politician, and she was also a bandit from Uttar Pradesh, India, a region in the north. This is the red portion kind of highlights the place. She was, now Mahashata Devi, the one we talked about right before Pullan Devi, was a writer. Pullan Devi was not a writer. She was many other things, but she was not really a writer. She was a Robin Hood figure who became famous because she was a bandit who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. She dedicated her life to advocating for caste equality. Now, in South Asia, Caste is a huge issue. Caste-based discrimination is often phrased as the hidden apartheid in India. So caste is a system of identification within Hinduism that categorizes people in terms of professions, right? So at the top, you have the priests. At the bottom, you have the sweepers and the cleaners, right? Now, and caste has often become today like class, right? Like upper and lower class, and that kind of has so caste has some of the same kind of feels, right? So a lower caste person, a person belonging to the lower caste, who are often called Dalits, have in many areas of life face discrimination because of their lower caste by upper caste individuals who belong to the priestly caste, the second that you see Kshatriyas, the warrior class, the merchant class, the landowner class. All these upper castes have often discriminated against the lower castes, including the Shudras and the outcasts, right? And the politics, the culture has often been biased, still is in South Asia, against some of these communities, right? So this is clearly an apartheid. It's a hidden apartheid because these discriminations are not official. They are normalized in day-to-day attitudes, right? But if you look at the figures through human rights reports and whatnot, you will see that like in so many people, so many women get raped, murdered, and become victims of atrocities just because of their lower class status, right? Sexual slavery is a thing in many contexts. Estimated 4 million people in India, among them 15 million, I meant 4 billion people. 40 million, sorry, I'm getting the facts wrong. 40 million people in India, among them 15 million children are bonded laborers, right? A majority of them are Dalits. So Pullan Devi, she came from a lower caste background called the Malla community. It was a community of boatsmen and fishermen, right? And she faced discrimination that included sexual violence, right? To an extent that she was forced to become an outlaw, right? And that kind of motivated her to advocate for people in her community and communities like hers, right? So she did ultimately come up with this memoir, I Pullan Devi, which became a very powerful document that testifies on caste discrimination in India. And she wrote this. She didn't write this. She kind of spoke to people who recorded her voice and opinions and then translated it, because she couldn't do it because she was illiterate. She didn't know how to read and write. So she did it in collaboration with translators and transcreators who recorded it and then published it as a memoir, right? And she did it mainly because during the 90s, her case became so popular that there were movies, there were newspaper articles that kind of had all kinds of rumors and nasty things to say about Fulan Devi. So she ultimately took charge and wrote her own account in this memoir, right? And this memoir kind of testifies the kind of brutality that she and other women in her position have experienced, right? Because the first victims of caste violence have often been women, and her memoir is a powerful testament to that. So again, she is one of those voices who have clearly used a literary way of recreating some of her experiences, because her story, again, and that's a different conversation, was accused that this is not real because many of the things that she recounts were countered by many others. So it is often it's a big debate that whether what she recounts in this book did it really happen, or was it just one version of what happened, right? So that's why this memoir is, of course, it does document some historical facts, but often trauma goes beyond objective. So when they're victims of certain violences, reality becomes relative, and I think this memoir kind of documents that very powerfully. Okay, finally, this is the last figure that I wanted to talk about, Bapsi Sidhwa. She's still alive. She was born in August 1938. She is now an American Pakistani novel. She spent a significant part of her life. She's also Gujarati Parsi descendant. Now, Parsi community, they're the Zoroastrian community, and it's a particular religion. So she belongs to the Parsi community. In Pakistan, so she's also Pakistani. So she spent a significant part of her childhood and adulthood in cities like Karachi and Lahore. So 1947 in India is a very significant year. That is the year when India achieved political independence from British colonialism, right? But it is also the year when Pakistan as a nation was born. She lived in British India, which after the partition in 1947 became Pakistan, right? So she pretty much witnessed the partition of India and Pakistan happening as a young 9-year-old, right? The partition of India is another one of those events that has left a trail of bodies, right? In August 14, 1947, Pakistan came into existence as a result of a movement. Again, so the division was done by the British. So in this map, you see the green part. Wait, is that to your left? It's called, it's West Pakistan. That is Pakistan now. And the orange part is India. But before the partition, all the green part and orange part, they were all in India. So in 1947, this border was drawn. And this border was called the Radcliffe Line because the guy who did it, his name was Radcliffe. He was a British colonial officer. So obviously what happened was, and this line was drawn in terms of in religious context, right? So Hindus were now had to move to India, and Muslims had to go to Pakistan because Pakistan became a Muslim nation, right? So the Hindus who lived in the Pakistan area were kicked out towards the India side, and the Muslims in the border area, which remained in India, were kicked to the Pakistan side. So it resulted in a massive displacement, right? So again, millions of people died and were displaced because of this. And again, there were the victims, the front victims were women who experienced sexual violence from both sides, right? So Bapsi Sidhwa wrote this novel called Cracking India that kind of documents this whole event, the whole partition. But it's interesting because it documents this event from a third person perspective, from the perspectives of the Parsi community, who were neither Hindus nor Muslims, but a small community that was in that region that experienced the partition, right? So, I mean, they did not have real stakes in this war, but still they experienced displacement. So you get this novel from the perspective of Parsis, right? And it is a semi-autobiographical novel because it's largely fictional, but it kind of, Bapsi Sidhwa relies on her own memory as a 9-year-old to recreate many of the scenes of the novel. And again, this novel, like the other two contexts, explores how rape was a powerful instrument of war in this scenario. So I do have a short video clip because a movie was made on this novel, a Bollywood movie, and it came out a long time back, I think like in the late 90s, if I'm not mistaken. But it kind of gives you a glimpse. It's a movie trailer, so it kind of gives you a broad glimpse of what was going on in the novel.
At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. खुशबू है तेरा बदन, सुलगे महके पिघले दहके, क्यों ना बहके मेरा
Mommy, can one big country afford to break India?
The division of India is imminent. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs will jockey for power. Wait and see. We will settle our differences ourselves.
So, right. So basically, this novel kind of shows that how a young girl who grew up with people who belong to both Hindu and Muslim communities living in harmony, suddenly, as the time of the partition came, turned against each other, and there was bloodshed in massive scale. So it tries to make sense of this tragedy unfolding in front of the eyes of this young 9-year-old who is pretty much Bapsi Sidhwa, as she remembers herself back when she was experiencing the partition. So this movie kind of looks into these moments of violence and tragedy in the life that left a deep impact in the consciousness of Sidhwa and many like her. So wait, oh, let me get to the last. Okay, so again, circling back to the question, should genocide and war be represented through fiction? I mean, it's a hard question because my take is yes, but one must be very aware of the way literatures are recruited to represent the pain of victims or represent war or genocide, because I mean, there are abundant examples of propagandas, right? That kind of demonstrate how war is justified, how the pain of one side is more important than the death and destruction of others, right? So there are propagandas everywhere, and propagandas are often very subtle, right? You have to really be trained to understand when a propaganda presents itself to you, right? But that is why literatures are called a training school for empathy, because you don't necessarily become empathetic right from the beginning, right? It's a process, right? And a good example, a good comparison is the life of a trauma nurse, right? In a trauma ward, right? Like, so what does a trauma nurse have to do? Because a trauma nurse, like if it's a regular human, the kind of blood and all the gore from the accidents and like the injuries would be enough to like really turn you off, right? But a trauma nurse often undergoes empathy training so that they are not, so when they see all the death and all the injuries in the trauma ward, they are somewhere in the middle. They don't become desensitized entirely, but at the same time, they can still be active and work in the presence of bloodshed, right? So that is what empathy tells you, right? Like, you have to be empathetic. You have to understand the pain of others. Because when you see violence, there are two different reactions. Either you just turn away and become apathetic because it's too much for you to handle, or you just don't care, right? So empathy training involves you to be somewhere in the center so that you care enough, but you do not get too distressed, so that you can positively think and be constructive when it comes to problem solving in a situation. So yes, my answer is yes, like fiction is an important medium for representation of war and literature, but that training is necessary, right? How to read literatures properly. How can literatures train us to become more empathetic, more ethical in terms of thinking about war and genocide? I guess that's it.
Thank you, Arnab. This was part of, I guess, our training today to recognize some of that, some of those aspects, both excellent aspects, but also really dangerous aspects of literature. Thank you. In terms of war and genocide, I now want to give the stage to our students and see if they have any questions rising from your lecture. And then it was, by the way, fun to see. It was Amir Khan, right? There in the, was it
What?
Amir Khan in the movie?
Yes, that was Amir Khan. Yeah.
That was young Amir Khan. That was interesting.
So
Okay.
he plays an awful guy in the film, but yeah, that was it. I like the movie. It's good.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I recognize him. Okay, so any questions? Yes, we have a question from Daniel.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think the propaganda is the same or similar all over the world, like all around the world?
I mean, yeah, like it kind of recruits some of the same strategies and ways of representation. But yeah, I mean, it depends on what kind of context it is, right? Like, for instance, during the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, like the Nazis like recruited films as a medium for spreading propaganda about how righteous the Nazis were against like Jews were, like they were like superior human beings and all that stuff. And those tactics are not any different from how different regimes around the world recruit propaganda to like create a consensus for their power, right? So I mean, propaganda is needed for a regime to survive because you need a sort of consensus so that the regime is not destabilized and removed, right? So yeah, fear is a big tool for regimes to survive, but fear along with a very narrow consensus. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's also interesting, Arnab, that you, even though you were bringing the examples from South Asia, I believe a lot of our students can find those parallels that we have studied throughout this semester, because we actually, one of the first readings that we did for our class was about British propaganda during World War I. And some of the images that you showed today, the mother figure, the woman representing the nation, the victim of war, all of those actually were exactly the same way present in British propaganda at the turn of century. So I think this was really helpful sort of to bring another perspective and another geographic region into our conversation. Plus, you also reflected a bit on something we discussed in our last class on Bangladesh, and during our last class, we actually were talking about this war and genocide and women's experiences. So I think it was really interesting how, even though we hadn't really planned what exactly you were going to talk about, you touched upon most of the things that we discussed in our class. So what other questions do our students have? Let's see. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay, on this side.
Do you think in more recent times the tropes of women in literature has changed, or do you still think they're quite registered in the stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean, like propaganda also like intensifies in immediate contexts of war, and like the wider like the distance becomes between the society and the situation of war, the intensity of propaganda kind of goes a little down. I mean, in Hollywood, you can still find propaganda in like everyday stuff that you watch, but it might not be as intense as the propaganda that you may find in a war zone. I mean, I'm sure like right now between Russia and Ukraine, right? Like there is like a programmed like Russian like strategy of like spreading propaganda, right? So yeah, like whenever you are in a direct situation of war, the intensity of propaganda would like proportionally go high, right? Like I mentioned about Kashmir in my presentation, right? About how there are these songs that kind of call on Hindus from all over India to come to Kashmir and marry all all the Muslims and convert them into Hindus so that the Muslim majority in Kashmir becomes a Hindu majority, right? And that kind of plays within the propaganda engine, right? So yeah, like if there is an immediate situation of uh, war, then yeah, the propaganda would increase, right? Like even in the United States, like propaganda, the question of propaganda has come up from time to time, especially in relation to the different kind of conflicts and war that US has engaged in different parts of the world, like against Afghanistan, where like there was a time when there was this whole idea about like the war against Afghanistan is justified because the US wants to go and liberate the women of Afghanistan against the oppression that they are facing. Like really, like was that the reason why the US was going into Afghanistan, to liberate the women against the, no, it was oil clearly, but again, like that is the kind of propaganda that you will often find in relation to war. Does that make sense?
Did you mean also just like in general how literature on war and women has changed throughout time?
Yeah, just like, I don't know, because like women are like allowed to be in the army and things like that, like it's kind of changed a little.
So I think what Lizzie also was trying to understand is like
Oh,
how
yeah,
throughout
yeah.
time the literature itself, because of more women participation, might have changed, whether it has changed or not.
It definitely has. I mean, like at least like it like I mean, I firmly believe that like it was not just like last 20 years that women started writing. Women have been writing forever, right? But like the focus has suddenly come upon it. Like so, like now you look and you will see like there are a lot of like very empathetic, genuine accounts written by women related to war. And in these accounts, of course, you will not find women in those stereotypical tropes that war propaganda literature often like puts them into, right? Like there are more complex roles in these. And again, like, I mean, again, like, yes, like there are literatures that treat war in a more complex manner have always existed, but yeah, these awarenesses that have definitely changed the direction towards a positive side, that many like war is being more complexly treated in literature and even like broader media.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so we turn to Kelly and then to Ryan.
Yes, please.
We've been like from what the discussion has been, it's been mostly about like the justification of a lot of things, like they do propaganda, so like how the US was like, we have to go and get women, like rescue them from this stuff. And I was already thinking about this justification when you brought up the fact that they were saying like how it was personified as the mother, that we have to protect it. It's kind of like we have to go into this war to protect our mother. But then when it was looking at the other side, they were seeing them as seductresses and just women that needed to, be sexually dominated. Do you think that that image was used for the soldiers themselves to justify their actions? And how did that stay with them after these events were over for you? Like, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I mean, like, thank you. That was a great question, by the way. And like all the questions that have come up are like awesome questions. Thank you so much for them. Like, I'm really happy the way you're engaging with these issues. And yeah, and that's I feel that's like a very important thing, like how does this representation happen, and like what is like the motivations behind this, right? Like often when war is committed, right, it becomes easier and more digestible when you just accept that the other side does not feel in the same way as we do, or in some way they deserve it, right? And the figure of the temptress, the prostitute, kind of ties in with that kind of that way of thinking. So that is pretty much how, I mean, I would say that does work, like the way you're putting it, right? Like, and again, like dehumanization has been another instrument of war, right? Like treating the victims as like less than humans, and this seductress, figure of seductress, reducing a woman into that is doing just that, whereas turning a woman into an ideal mother kind of is working the opposite way, right? Where you're like this figure is so sacred that we must do everything that we can to protect her, right? To protect the nation. So yeah, that ideology is pretty much you will find in any context of war, I'd say.
Perfect. So our last question goes to Brian.
Yes, please.
So you said the Parsi people. I know that the Parsi is the language of the Persians, and that the Persians, I don't know what religion the Persians were before Arabs brought Islam over there. Obviously that's long history, but so what, I didn't know there was a Parsi people.
Just
What religion were they?
he actually mentioned that, probably you'll reflect on it. So the Zoroastrians that he mentioned in the lecture, Zoroastrianism,
What is that?
that's the religion which came before Islam. And that's what Parsi people and Iranians before Islam followed. It's
Okay.
a
So they believed in
pre-Islamic
Omega.
religion, Zoroastrianism. But yeah, let's listen to what he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, like the Zoroastrians have always, as a community, and this kind of comes out very centrally in the novel Cracking India. Like Bapsi Sidhwa says that like the Parsi community has always been, they're the perpetual immigrants, right? Because they were like, at a time they were like cast off from Persia, and they kind of took shelter in many different countries, including different parts of South Asia. So, and again, they were always treated as guests, right? So, and that kind of adds to the complexity of this whole dynamics, right? Like where, like she says that we don't have any stakes in this war, which is a good thing and a bad thing, because no nation really treats us as their own. We are always seen as outsiders, but then this community faces the situation where they suddenly find themselves against two or three like other like parties fighting with each other. And there are definite situations, there are times where that the novel discusses where the Parsi community meets and tries to discuss what should be our stance. Are we taking side here? Are we taking sides with the Muslims or the Hindus? Are we staying neutral? Because whatever we do, chances are we're still going to get killed, right? So yeah, I think like what you kind of identified there is like a very complex situation that Bapsi Sidhwa talks about, and her perspectives are unique because of that, because you do have a lot of narratives about the partition out there, but not many narratives look at the partition and or look at such tragedies through the eyes of a community that gets caught between a war, right? But has no real stakes in it.
Okay, all of the great questions. I will say that we should probably wrap this up because we tend to keep our I guess lectures longer than we promised, but thank you very much for your really interesting presentation and lecture. We all learned a lot today, and I will also thank the students for their great questions, and we will finish our recording with this.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I had a great time talking to you all. And again, like if you guys ever have any follow-up questions, feel free to like reach out to me. I'm like always available and like happy to answer whatever questions or doubts you have.